The morning the stage rolled up to Dry Creek with its leather-bellied cargo of coin and mail, Eleanor Nell Mercer stood with her palms against the cool iron of the safe and felt the world tilt a degree she did not expect. At 39, with the widow's crease at the corner of her mouth softened but still present, she had learned to read a ledger like a prayer book, columns and margins that held the truth of a town. For 10 years, she had been Wells Fargo's agent in Dry Creek, the woman who signed for payrolls, sorted letters women wrote in hiding, and counted the wages of men who boasted bravery and could not tell the truth to save their own hides. The destruction of that ledger did not happen in one dramatic gust. It happened in a morning of bad luck and better con, a robbery in daylight in which two men in respectable coats, one of them the acting stage line foreman, a man Nell had trusted with roots and manifests, walked right through her door and took a chest of gold. She fought, of course she did. She always fought. But she was a widow and a woman, and a body is only so large an obstacle when greed comes with gunpowder and authority. Her husband, Thomas Mercer, had been dead 3 years to a fever that took him in a single moonless night. She had kept on because running the Wells Fargo office in a place like Dry Creek was an honest thing. And honesty kept a dozen families fed during the winter of low herds. She had a ledger had teeth, and she used them to make careful, measured decisions. She used them, too, to keep the small, private medicine trunk her mother had taught her to use, bottle tinctures, clean cloth, salves, and the fingers that could stitch flesh and reckon taxes. The county sheriff came in that afternoon with a ribbon of threat in his voice. "Ledger's missing papers, Ms. Mercer. All gone. Stage payroll, too. We need to know who had access," he said, his eyes sliding around the room as if the walls themselves might confess. The town councilmen circled, not with sympathy but with calculation. Men who had eaten at her table and lent a hand when her husband was buried were suddenly intent on recalculating favors. "Maybe a theft, maybe an inside job," one of them muttered, and the phrase settled like ash in Nell's mouth. She had suspicions. She'd been an agent long enough to understand the patterns that men like to keep, who got to hold keys, who signed manifests, who had reasons to lie. The foreman, good with a ledger, better with flattery, had been seen arguing with the driver the night before. The driver was quiet, the sort of fellow who knuckles his ham in his pockets and pretends not to own a name. A clerk at the office had been oddly absent the morning of the robbery, citing family business that did not exist. Nell wrote down everything. She had a small, stubborn faith in paper and ink. But paper does not stop a pistol, and letters do not protect a woman against suspicion. When the county wanted to show strength, they needed someone to blame. A stranger in town started murmuring that the Mercers had been soft with money, that grief made people careless. The gossip of Dry Creek is a tool men use like a whip. The loss of the payroll meant wages delayed. A bakery owner told her in no uncertain terms that she had to account for the money because his ovens would go cold without it. Nell felt cornered between moral duty and a growing, righteous anger. She was running out of time before Dry Creek decided not only that she was culpable, but that her position should be held by a man who could more easily answer to the sheriff's questions. Beyond the immediate crisis, there was a deeper injustice. Someone with knowledge of Wells Fargo's roots and of Nell's husband's notes had engineered the theft. The hand had been inside a room Nell had trusted. The idea made her stomach twist in a way that was not only about the money, but about a life she had tried to rebuild after Thomas. Grief had been a companion she had learned to live with, but indignity had no place beside it. Her decision, slow as winter coming in, formed itself in the hollow of her hand. She would not let the men in coats define her fate. The first wave of the town's retaliation came in whispers and looks. A councilman hinted that her lease to the office might be revoked. Her neighbor at the boarding house warned her to keep a low profile. More dangerous were the men in the saloon who took to making jokes about a woman who kept the town's money. It took one man, however, an outlaw with eyes like dry earth and a reputation that moved ahead of him like morning fog, to intrude on Nell's plan. He arrived the night before she planned to present her own case to the town, swaggering into the mercantile with boots so old the leather seemed to groan. He was on the wanted list, hanging in the sheriff's office with a reward that could buy a small farm. She had seen his wanted poster twice in her life, and 2 times is too many. Caleb Boone, the paper said, and Nell had ironed in her mind the stories. Stage robberies the length of a county line, a quick hand that could pick locks and hearts, and a streak of honor that's either true or invented by people who like myths. When he spoke to her in the lamplight, he did not offer a swaggering apology. He said simply, "Ms. Mercer, your ledger's been touched by hands that know more than a foreman should. I can find out who." The absurdity of the proposition was not lost on her. The sheriff's posse would bay for Caleb's neck, but would not ask if the men who stood in front of Nell's safe had paperwork in their pockets. She looked at him, mid-40s maybe, his jaw a map of older sorrows, and felt an old, stubborn thread knot in her chest. She could entrust her safety to the law and hope that justice wasn't a luxury, or she could do something riskier and align with a man every decent woman had been trained to fear. But when the choice was whether to be the kind of woman who allowed injustice to become her future, she chose differently. She would take the risk. She would accept an unlikely alliance if it meant standing a chance to unmask the conspiracy that had cost her everything. She did not know then that this decision would become the hinge upon which the rest of her life swung. All she knew was ledger lines and the fact that grief had taught her to be cautious. When danger came clothed in respect and offered the chance to fight back, she would not turn away. Nell set conditions. When Caleb Boone smiled in the dim of the boarding house parlor, she held the papers of the stage manifests like talismans between them. "You don't get to touch the ledger," she said, voice steady. "You don't decide for me who answers. You are a tool I hire, not a man I take orders from." He nodded as if he were pleased to be contained. That first night he matched her lists with stories from the road. A man with a foreman's badge who preferred whiskey to calculation. A driver who suddenly had extra coin and a new hat. But more important, Caleb told her what the sheriff would not, how an inside job is never merely a moment of opportunity, but a long mending of information. The same man who arranged routes puts a hand on the ledger and learns the family's names attached to each payment. He learns when a stage will have few guards and which wives will be waiting with the midwife's palms. Nell listened, and she set the ledger beside her like a partner in its own right. She did not trust him. Trust, she had learned in widowhood, must be built like a table, one leg at a time until it could bear weight. So she trained Caleb to be useful in ways that were not romantic or naive. She taught him how the manifests were read, how to count the chain of custody of a payroll, how to recognize a forged signature. In return, he taught her how a wanted man moves through towns without binding himself to gossip. He taught her how to read the tracks outside her office, how to follow a carriage without being noticed, and how to keep a story ready for an inquisitive bartender. Their first outing together was not a high chase through sage, but a careful, quiet evening at the rail yard, where a manifest was said to have been left. Nell slipped beneath the bony light of a quarter moon, like any woman who had learned to slip, and her fingers felt for the soft place where paper meets rust. She had always been good with small hands, sewing, bandaging, counting coins with the precision of a lover. Caleb sat back against a coal car and watched, his silhouette a promise without tenderness. He did not try to protect her with a gun. Instead, he covered her back with the sort of gaze that had kept him alive when lawmen wanted his head. What built between them in those early nights was not heat, but respect. Nell found she could say things aloud she had only ever written in the quiet of the office. She barked orders at him, precise and to the point, and he answered with equal clarity. When a mule driver nodded at them, Caleb interrupted with a gossip coy question that pulled a name out better than any threat. Nell noted the answers in her mind. The foreman had been seen leaving with the sheriff's deputy late. The deputy had visited a saloon's back room more than was proper. Her competence made him deferential in a way that troubled her in a delicious, dangerous manner. He recognized her knowledge of routes and the fact that she could read the county ledgers like a map of motives. That was the first gift he gave her, seeing her ability as something to be relied on rather than as a weakness to be corrected. When she proposed a plan that involved sneaking a ledger back into the office to test a theory, Caleb did not scoff. He made a route for her. One night, while the town slept and the moon cut cold white lines across the washboard roofs, they enacted what Nell called a rehearsal. Caleb perched in the shadows while she mounted the staircase to the office, her heart twisted, not with fear, but with a fierce, bright determination. She undid a back window, the sash complaining in a sound like a small animal, then eased herself inside. Her fingers smoothed the empty place where paper had been, and replaced a forged copy she had made in the weeks since the robbery. It was a small, clever thing, a replica of a manifest with a deliberate, tiny error she knew would set a particular man to fluid words when he saw how it had been handled. The plan worked. Within 2 days, the man who had been absent the morning of the theft appeared in a saloon where his voice rose like a wind tearing a tent. He swore to anyone who would listen about how he had been trapped into lending a hand to men with more wits than honor. The sheriff listened, and the sheriff's mind, always looking for a simple resolution, nodded. But Nell had more than saloon talk. She had used the town's tendency to boast against them, set a trap of their own making. Caleb's skills were not merely criminal. He was observant in a way that could be mistaken for roving curiosity. He cataloged faces and movements, small things that lent themselves to a map. He could taste lies in a man's mouth and prick them like a bladder. He and Nell were beginning to move as a unit, two instruments struck together to make a better, clearer sound. That gave Nell a strange comfort. She had always been alone in her decisions, but here was a partner who made space for her leadership. When word began to trickle that some of the town's men had been seen at an odd hour with the foreman, Nell felt that taut, hungry thing inside her turn toward hope. She had been wounded not only by loss, but by the theft of her competence. Now she had begun to stitch her life with new thread. The town's whispering anger cooled, replaced by a thin, cautious inquiry that could be used to turn suspicion where it belonged. Caleb watched her set a meeting with the widow who lived by the river, an old woman who mended socks and kept her mouth on hinges like a locked gate. Nell listened to her, then offered a small sum of coin for information. The widow took it and gave them the detail that mattered. The foreman had been seen giving a ring to the deputy's wife, a ring with a crest that matched an old Wells Fargo stamp. The facts fit together like a puzzle that had been taken apart by greedy hands. They were building a case not on rumor, but on the slow, patient collection of truth. By the end of the week, Nell realized the unthinkable. She was not only enlisting Caleb for his stealth and speed, but she was learning to rely on him as she had once relied on Thomas's steady hand. But reliance did not mean surrender. Each step she took with Caleb confirmed that she was the architect of the plan. He was the tool she wielded, and that mattered. Her history had taught her what it was to be at the mercy of other people's decisions. Now she made hers with the steady, brittle spirit of someone who had been wronged and would not be so again. They found refuge in a place that was no one's first choice, a row of cabins on the western edge of Dry Creek owned by women who had husbands out on the range or sons in the mines. The women kept their windows shut against the dust and tended gardens that stubbornly refused to die. Nell had known them all. Martha Tilley, who baked the best biscuits in 3 counties and had a tongue like a whip. Mercy Choate, who kept a garden full of herbs and an eye for a secret. And Liza Grant, who had once run a saloon and knew how to read a man's stomach like a page. They gave Nell a room with sheets, and what she needed more than anything, a place to lay the ledger and breathe. That first week in the cabin, Nell understood what the word healing would mean for her. It would not be the soft, religious thing the portrait painters made. It would be practical and stubborn. Mercy Choate taught her which roots to steep to pull fever down. Nell found herself in the morning at the window, hands immersed in warm water, sewing the rents in a coat someone had pawned, counting stitches with the same care she had once reserved for banknotes. She cooked in a cast-iron pan, her hands learning the rhythm of onions and fat, and the little magic that made something whole from simple things. She slept with the ledger beneath her pillow sometimes, not from superstition, but as a strategist keeps a map near at hand. In the privacy of that cabin, she began to reclaim small joys. She mended a child's sock and felt a strange ache of pride at the neatness of her stitches. She taught Mercy the difference between a counterfeit signature and a hurried forgery. In exchange, Mercy taught her to make a salve that would stop the hide from blistering when the latigo was cut. The other women offered more than physical help. They offered stories of independence in a world that treasured a woman's marriage as her identity. Martha Tilley, whose husband had not come back from a winter drove, spoke of starting a bakery and building credit with a ledger she had learned to keep. Liza shared the story of how she had paid off a mortgage by running the back room of a saloon and lending out small sums to women starting new. These women were not dramatic in their solidarity. They were relentless. When Nell walked into the kitchen and found a pot of soup simmering on the stove, it meant they had been awake thinking of how to keep her going. When they chose to call Caleb by his name rather than Outlaw, it was an act of acceptance that warmed something in Nell's chest. For all her independence, she had been lonely. Their steady presence became scaffolding. She began to make decisions about her future in the quiet that came when the sun slanted behind the hills. The idea of leaving Dry Creek for a place where grief could be less contagious drifted through her like light. She thought of running a stage line herself, of moving money with honesty, and building a business that would answer to her ledger alone. The idea felt dangerous and exhilarating both. To be a woman who kept property in her own name was to rewrite the scripts towns like Dry Creek loved to read. It was not a fanciful plan, but a practical one. She could manage payrolls, she could manage routes, and more importantly, she could train women to do the same. Her early decisions were concrete. She reopened the Wells Fargo office to the public under a new sign she'd painted in the back room, N. Mercer, Agent, because if she could not hold the title, she could at least command the counters. She insisted on putting the day's receipts into a separate locked chest with her initials carved into the wood. It was not an act of vanity, but of legal protection. She found, too, that she liked it when customers deferred to her knowledge, farmers asking her about the value of a shipment, a teacher asking about a parcel of money being sent for school books. The ledger once more became her daily altar, and each neat entry she penned reknit a seam inside her. Caleb watched these changes with the same careful curiosity he used to watch trails. He adapted to the cabin life in a way that impressed Nell. He learned to sleep without the edge of a saddle under him and to keep his hands from instinctive violence. They shared meals and sometimes sat in companionable silence, the kind that is earned rather than assumed. As they exchanged small domesticities, the relationship tilted toward equal footing. He asked her advice, and startlingly to her, he accepted it. Meanwhile, they used that safe haven to plan. Nell reconstructed the timeline of the robbery and placed each player in a timeline with her ledger marking the steps. She saw how the deputy's visits began shortly after Thomas had a private meeting with a lender over a mortgage. She saw how a small loan had been turned into a significant wedge. With each thread she pulled, more of the conspiracy unfurled. She took it not as a man seeking revenge, but as a woman who demanded fairness. There were moments of doubt, late-night hours where the house groaned, and Nell would press her forehead to the cool window and remember Thomas's voice. These were not weaknesses. They were anchors for memory and for the grit that turned sorrow into resolve. When the children of townspeople came around to collect school books, Nell gave them extra coins for sweets and found laughter creeping back into her mouth. She began to imagine a life where sadness would not be the first thing on the table. In the cabin, she also stepped into modest physical power. When a messenger came to threaten her with the sheriff's intent to hold her responsible, Nell met him at the door and offered him tea, and the quiet surety in her voice unsettled him more than a gun might have. Her posture and the way she kept the ledger visible were small rebellions. She was learning that authority could be maintained by firmness, by knowledge, and by the knowledge that a woman's hands can be just as precise as a man's. One evening, Nell sat with Caleb by the hearth and told him plainly that she was tired of running from the fact of what had been stolen from her. "I want more than my name cleaned," she said. "I want the people who thought they could put their boots on my ledger to be made to answer." Caleb's face was hard, but his voice softened. "Then we'll see them answer," he said. "Not I will, but we." The pronoun made a small, vivid thing unfurl in Nell's chest. The idea that she did not have to be alone to be strong. She could choose her allies and keep her own voice. Caleb Boone's past arrived with the scent of worn leather and the quiet patience of a man who had kept 1,000 small secrets. Nell had not wanted to know the details at first. She preferred the myth to remain a tool. But as they moved closer to unmasking the inside job, she found his history useful. He had once driven stages himself, had learned the seams of how they were run and how they could be run amok. More importantly, he had friends on the road who still owed him favors, and knowledge passed like currency among those who moved in the shadows. One afternoon, while they worked the route lists at Nell's table and the kettle hissed like a broken promise, Caleb pulled out a scrap of memory and offered it like a gift. He told her about a town south of Dry Creek, where a deputy had accepted money to look the other way during a robbery. He told her how the deputy had learned to keep his conscience neat by only doing wrong for the people who kept him. At first, Nell listened guarded, but then she realized here was the map of motive she needed. The deputy's rise connected to a man who wanted a banking route for himself, a man with interest in land and influence. Caleb's old skills, his knack for unseen movement, his ability to coax secrets out of tavern mouths, his comfort in places where honest men did not go, became instruments in Nell's hands. She used them like chisels, guiding him with the steady hand of someone who had learned to wield tools precisely. She did not ask him to be anything he was not. She asked him to lend what the world had labeled as sinful for the sake of righting a wrong. He agreed, but on terms that respected her leadership. Their partnership was most notable in the way decisions were made. When they discovered that a shipment manifest had been hidden in the deputy's wife's trunk, Nell did not order Caleb to retrieve it. She proposed the plan, mapped the escape routes, and set a code by which they'd operate. Caleb executed the plan with the careful speed of someone who had learned to respect boundaries. When he brought back the manifest, his hands were steady. Nell's handwriting circled a line in the manifest that matched a loan agreement she had once attended with Thomas, a document that showed the foreman had not acted alone. As they followed the web of connections, a new truth emerged. The man pulling strings was not just a greedy businessman, but a man who had wielded civic respect like a weapon. He had used his place on the county board to steer contracts and had a ledger of his own, one that showed a pattern of siphoning money through phony repairs and consultations. This was not a robbery of opportunity. It was a long game in which Nell's office had been a target because it was trusted. Nell considered her choices with the cold clarity of someone who understood leverage. She could go to the sheriff and offer the manifest, but then the sheriff would decide how to proceed, and she did not trust him to see justice through without the filth of compromise. Or she could gather a coalition, a group of witnesses whose lives would be undone if the conspiracy stood. She chose the latter. She began to frame the evidence not as personal betrayal, but as a civic wrong that endangered dozens. Caleb's knowledge of men's vices, who drank where, who took bribes, and for what small things, helped her assemble a list of people who would speak, and a group who would be compelled to answer. There were moments when the lines between his redemption and hers blurred. Caleb confessed one night, sitting at the foot of her bed in the cabin, that he had once stolen from a woman who had trusted him. The memory did not beg forgiveness. It was offered like a hand showing a scar. Nell listened, not as a woman who must forgive to be whole, but as a partner deciding whether a man could be leaned upon in battle. He showed remorse, but more importantly, he had the courage to change his habits of secrecy into habits of truth. That change mattered more than any confession. As their plans tightened, Nell realized that this man, wanted and feared, had something no deputy did, an instinct for truth beyond badges. He knew how to pressure men into revealing what they'd done without resorting to legal theater. He could arrange a circumstance where a guilty man would expose himself by his own greed. Together, they orchestrated a sting, a staged repayment, where the conspirators would believe they were being paid off, and in their haste, they'd show the paper trail. It was the sort of cunning that made Nell's hands shake with excitement. Through the process, she noticed small, important shifts in Caleb. He listened to her moral calculus and adopted it as his own, not because she demanded it, but because she clarified the stakes. He became, in small, humiliating ways, a student of her ethics. He learned that there are differences between taking from the indifferent and taking from the needy, and that justice is a thing that dignifies the giver as much as the receiver. Nell, for her part, learned to trust his instincts and let him act where her name might make him vulnerable. It was a fine ballet of risk. When the time came to move against the man who had used civic office for private greed, they did not do it as lovers or as a rescuer and a rescued. They did it as equals, each lending different strengths. Nell's voice carried weight when she stood in the town hall and read evidence aloud. The townsfolk were used to her measurements and the care she took with numbers. Caleb's presence in the crowd was a reminder that law was sometimes a theater, and that justice required witnesses who would not be bullied. He stood back while she spoke. He did not try to eclipse her. Caleb's past thus served Nell's future. His sins and skills were harnessed to reveal the rot inside Dry Creek's respectable institutions. More than that, his willingness to defer to her when it mattered taught him something about love. That respect is not merely given, it is earned through acknowledgement of another's competence. He began to see her as an equal not through words, but through the conduct of a man willing to follow her leadership in the plans that dislodged the conspiracy. The backbone of Nell's anger was not only the missing money, but the erosion of trust that had been surgically removed from her life. She had tried to keep grief private after Thomas died, to honor him through quiet actions, paying debts, returning misplaced coins, maintaining standards in the office. To have those standards used against her, to see men who had expected the world to bend toward them use their positions to loot, felt like an extension of Thomas's body being robbed a second time. She would not, she decided, let that theft stand unpunished. She spent nights reconstructing the ledger details, turning each page like a witness. The more she read, the more she recognized how the paper trail had been manipulated, not with haphazard greed, but with careful, repeated edits. Names had been erased, then re-entered in ways to obfuscate. The payroll had been split into smaller amounts, funneled into accounts that were in practice phantoms. The man at the center, Elias Hargreave, was the sort of person who kept a public persona like a well-polished shoe, and private accounts like a boil under the sole. Nell felt all the old tools of the law and society were inadequate. The sheriff was compromised. The deputy, half in the pockets of Hargreave, would not arrest his own. The judge could be swayed by donations. So Nell crafted a new instrument, the public telling. She gathered affidavits, ledgers, and witnesses, not simply to take to the law, but to the people whose lives Hargreave's corruption had touched, storekeepers who had sold on credit, wives who had borrowed rations and found the well dry, and men who had been paid lesser wages because coin had been pilfered from payrolls. In the full light of day, she brought her evidence to the town square. She did not scream, she read. She read the line items and the dates and the numbers, the way an honest person reads scripture. "This," she said, placing the manifest upon a makeshift table, "is how we have been taken. This is how lives were made smaller so one man's house could be larger." She watched faces change, felt her words settle through the crowd like a tide. There was anger, and there was the slow, steady dawning of recognition. Men shifted, some denying, some ashamed. Hargreaves' men answered with thin insults and threats, but the paper did not lie. The widow who ran the boarding house spoke up and said she had accepted a loan from Hargreaves' company, only to find herself doubled in debt when interest came due. The foreman, when confronted with the forged signatures, faltered. Under the light of collective testimony, his story broke in places. The plan, however, had dangers. When Nell uncovered that Hargreave had not only financial ties but also strong influence among the rail company, a man who could bribe inspectors and ensure shipments were delayed, she realized the stakes were higher than simple theft. This was a man who could end not only her career, but the livelihoods of many. He moved with the complacency of privilege until it was rubbed raw by her words. The deputy tried to arrest Caleb in a plain attempt to intimidate the pair, but Nell refused to be moved. She stepped between the law and the man she had chosen as an ally. "You found something on him if you must," she told the deputy, voice like leather stretched and warm. "You will find only my name and my evidence. You will not make a fool of a widow without answering for why your hands were in the drawer." Her bravery did not end in grand gestures. It was present in the quiet, difficult choices, like when she refused to accept hush money from a man who offered to pay off the harmed parties without making the matter public. An offer made with the bland smile of a man who believed that money could erase guilt. "No," she told him, and the word cost her something in social invitation and in small comforts, but it gained her the trust of the women whose grocery accounts had been affected. "If you will not be named, you will not change." Caleb watched her decisions with fierce admiration. He had been a man who had believed his path was set. Steal, run, survive. Nell was changing the terms. She was not killing men or delivering frontier justice with a pistol. She was using their own systems against them. She used law and public shame to extract truth. It was a kind of skill he had not believed wieldable by someone who preferred the sharp accuracy of a pistol to the slow, grinding justice of papers. He learned to admire the quiet force of a woman's persistence. The confrontation came when Hargreave, cornered by public testimony, lashed out. He hired thugs and threatened legal suits. He tried to bully the council to remove Nell, threatening to take his business elsewhere if the town did not oust her. He assumed Dry Creek valued his patronage more than the livelihood of its people. Hargreave did not know this town's women. They had learned to gather against unfairness more often than men cared to notice. Nell met threats by choosing strategy over bravado. She had Caleb place watch in the night and called together the women of the town to keep an eye on the deputy's movements. She arranged for the children who had been shorted on school fund money to be given dents of coin that would be noticed to have been repaid. She filed a public complaint citing the manifest evidence and issued a challenge to Hargreave. Meet in public, answer the charges, or the papers would be sent to the state auditor. Hargreave expected her to be afraid. He expected the weight of his wealth to cow her. Instead, she chose to feel the fear and act anyway. She had not been made, in all the years since Thomas's death, into someone who shrank. The ledger, that honest, untidy book, had become the lever she used to pry up rot. The town began to realize that a system of corruption depended on silence. Once the silence broke, the system would convulse. She did not want revenge. Revenge was a cage that kept its occupant from moving forward. She wanted restitution and accountability. Her fight, therefore, was not just for herself, but for the women who had learned to survive on the underside of men's deals. She wanted the town to be a place where a widow could run a business without fear of having her name mudded by men in coats. And so she continued, clear-eyed, with Caleb and the women's watchful support, to corner the man who had once believed himself untouchable. Each day, the evidence mounted. Each day, her voice grew a hair more fearless. She taught Caleb how to file papers and how to speak a woman's logic. Not a pleading list, but a statement of fact. He, in turn, taught her sterner lessons about movement and about how quickly a man with nothing to lose will try to break anyone who stands in his way. Together, they prepared for the moment when this entire web would either collapse or burn. There is a difference between two people who stand near one another and two people who stand together. Nell had spent years standing alone, in an industry that prized a woman's ability to be useful without making waves. Caleb, who had long lived by a code that was survival first and sentiment nowhere, found a different rhythm and partnership. They worked side by side with a shared understanding that each brought vital strengths to the table. Their strategy sessions were not melodramatic. They involved clockwork, mapping times, sending notes, making calls through people who could be trusted. Nell invented a code, colored threads tied to ledger pages to mark the authenticity of manifests. Caleb found ways to move those pages without being visible. He built distractions when she needed to enter a room. He provided an ear when she wanted to speak a piece of hard truth to an ally. Romance, insofar as it existed between them, was not the rush of first love, but the slower, deeper connection of two people who see each other's cracks and fit a hand in them without making the other's ruin. There were evenings when they sat and patched clothes while they planned how to compel a reluctant witness to testify. There were mornings when they drank coffee and cataloged the leads they had compiled. Their intimacy was not made of grand proclamations, but of small acts. Caleb learning to fetch Mercy's herbs the way she liked them crushed. Nell asking for his opinion on route timing and actually applying it. These things built the scaffolding of respect. She taught him arithmetic with the patience of a teacher, how to spot a double-entry ledger meant to deceive, how to value land sales on paper when they were really conduits for bribery. He showed her how to move unnoticed, how to approach a saloon keeper with a posture that invited gossip rather than defense. They learned to laugh in a way that had been forbidden in grief's first years. They taught each other to be better than their worst instincts. The townspeople started noticing the two of them as a unit. It made people uneasy to see a woman in charge with a wanted man at her side, not because the law demanded it, but because the town's notion of order was being rewritten in public. The most remarkable thing, for Nell, was that she liked him more for the ways he was changing than for the ways he had been. He listened to her. He deferred when it was prudent to let her speak. He did not demand to lead simply because tradition would have granted him that right. When they faced the council together, he accepted that the ledger's voice was hers and lent his presence to amplify it. Her teaching him also worked the other way. Nell, who had always kept her sympathy folded and measured, learned to let the odd, careless things slip. She allowed herself to be rescued from the black thoughts that sometimes came at night by someone who held her without trying to fix her. She gave him cornered trust in return for the hard work he did at her side. She never became a woman in need, and he never tried to make her such. That was the key to their partnership. She chose him, and he chose to stand with her. They constructed an operation in which men and women of the town played roles. Liza Grant gathered whispers from the gambling tables and fed them to Caleb. Mercy Choate kept the herbs and concoctions, and she trained the younger women to notice subtle physical signs that a juror might miss in testimony. Martha Tilley opened her bakery for late-night meetings, the steam of bread disguising the hushed voices plotting justice. The women were not trophies in Nell's story, but central actors who reinforced the idea that solidarity is a practical weapon, not a sentimental one. There were tests. When a bribe arrived with an attempt to threaten Caleb with old crimes, Nell did not waver. She declared publicly that past actions were not to be judged by private men now arranging moral calculus. They were to be evaluated by the law, and only the facts would stand. The town, fed up with Hargreaves' sugar-sweeted influence, began to coalesce. Men who had been afraid to speak found reason to breathe. Women raised their heads and told stories of unpaid wages and failed contracts. As they plotted to present their amassed evidence at the county hearing, they rehearsed their testimonies together. Nell coached a butcher on how to present numbers without angering the judge. Caleb coaxed a quiet man into a clear memory of who had leaned on him during payroll nights. It was meticulous work. Each person who testified was a filament in the web they had cast. Their planning had compassion. Nell insisted the women be ready to care for those who would be arrested, and for those whose reputations would be punctured by truth. She believed in consequence, but not in cruelty. Justice is not sport, she said. It is repair. Caleb, whose experience had been more primal, came to understand that repair could be a greater reward than the sort of quick, violent satisfaction he had known. On the eve of the hearing, they sat beneath the shelter of a starlit sky, and Nell counted the pages one last time. Caleb watched her, his face cast in a softer shade by the fire. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "This is our moment," she said. It was the moment not of a man rescuing a woman, but of two people who had decided that an injustice had to be faced together. The partnership had, in its own way, become an act of defiance against the small, persistent tyranny of a town that had learned to accept corruption because it was easier than standing up. Nell stood the morning of the county hearing in front of her office with the sun catching the brass letters of Wells Fargo, now accompanied by the smaller sign she had insisted on, N. Mercer Agent. She looked at the faces that gathered. neighbors, people she had known since the period when Thomas and she had used to set a table for the entire town, and she felt the weight of choice as if it were a physical thing draped over her shoulders. The choice, simple and terrible, had always been hers. Stay safe and allow a compromise that would buy personal peace but not justice, or risk everything to demand accountability. There were seductive alternatives. One of Hargreaves' men had offered a settlement in private, money returned to the town without public humiliation, a promise that Nell's name would be kept quiet and that the manager's position would remain hers. It would have kept the bakery ovens burning and the children's shoes from wear. It would have kept some peace in Dry Creek. The argument for quiet was pragmatic, but Nell had seen how small payments had turned men into accomplices. Silence would be complicity. It would teach other men that the path to power was to attack the vulnerable and then pay them off quietly. She thought of Thomas's hands, calloused and warm, and of the ledger that had been her lifeline. She thought of the women who had given her refuge and the children who would not now be shorted on school supplies. She pictured herself older, perhaps with a small ranch or a stage line, and knew that if she accepted hush money, the next generation would learn to expect their leaders to be bought. The vision of a future life was not, to her, a seductive promise for romance, but a moral map. She could imagine a life of calm at the cost of peace in the town. She could also imagine a more tumultuous road that carved a safer way for others. Caleb watched her facing this decision with the quiet that had become his habit. He did not push. He never had. He had offered to run when the threat became too great, and he had offered his own life on occasion like a currency he had no shame in spending. But he trusted her capacity to choose. "You'll pick wrong if you let them frighten you," he said, standing nearby with the easy gruffness of a man who had felt fear and acted anyway. "Pick what's right for you, not just what's easiest." She drew breath and made her choice. She would not accept a settlement. She would bring the evidence to the public hearing and ask for justice to be done openly. This was not an act of bravado. It was a strategic decision. Public shame in the territory of Hargreaves' power would be punishing, but public truth could not be bought back into silence. She sent for witnesses and prepared her speech with the meticulous care of someone who understood how words could be as dangerous as pistols. The hearing itself was a title thing. Hargreave arrived with a retinue and a voice that had been practiced in the galleries where men like him are taught to charm. He laughed off the accusations with a smile that had been polished in the light of other people's complacency. The county judge, who was used to pleading men and sheepish confessions, squinted at the table heavy with documents. Nell spoke first. She read the ledgers and point by point tied names to transactions, dates to movements, signatures to the forged marks she'd trained her eye to find. Caleb sat in the back and watched the crowd. He was not above a human need to see the man who had once been on the wrong side of a law feel the weight of the court's gaze, but his presence mattered less than the fact that Nell was the one who commanded the stage. She walked the room through the trail of evidence and showed with patience and numbers how the theft had been orchestrated. The deputy, who had tried to intimidate them, squirmed. He had not expected to be a man under investigation. For a few enchanted minutes, Nell allowed herself a small private pleasure, the realization that all those nights of pain and careful work were culminating in a space where her voice could shape reality. She did not expect Hargreave to storm or to apologize. She expected resistance. He offered both, and more. He launched legal threats and cajoled witnesses to maintain silence, but townspeople were no longer transfixed by his smile. The women who had helped Nell testified with confidence because Nell had prepared them to do so. At one point, when a witness grew uncertain and fingers tightened around the edge of a chair, Caleb rose and offered a quiet comment that steadied the testimony without stealing it. The deputy attempted to call for order, but the room had shifted. The town began to see itself in the clear mirror Nell had held up. Her insistence on the public nature of justice, that taking coin from a town is not a private errand but a civic crime, resonated. Men who had been complacent felt ashamed. The hearing stretched long into the day as each piece of evidence stitched a new understanding. There was a brief, gentle interlude that afternoon when Nell and Caleb stepped into the sunlight outside the hall. For a few minutes, they let themselves imagine a life that was quieter, one where they rode without the weight of the hearing tugging at them. They allowed themselves a syllable of hope. "If this goes well," Nell said, "we can both make new lives." He smiled and said, "Make them with me." The words were not a claim, but an offer she could choose to accept. That moment of imagined futures was the calm before the onslaught. They knew the hearing would not end the battle. It was a necessary step in a longer war. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Nell felt a real sense that she was shaping a life of her own choosing. not one prescribed by loss and rumor. The choice had always been hers, to accept quiet compensation or to demand public accountability, and in choosing the latter, she already felt a lightness. Her future, whether beside Caleb or on her own, would be hers to define. Victory was not a straight line. Even as the town watched and murmured over the hearing, forces aligned against Nell with the speed of crows descending. Hargreave had resources that would not easily be snuffed. He hired lawyers who knew how to stall and named men who would testify they had no memory or had been mistaken about details. The deputy who had once been complicit found new excuses, and a few men who had been bribed to stay silent were offered more lucrative hush money. Hargreave's associates brought in the kind of legal weight that could tie a person in court for months, and Dry Creek's patience wore thin as the town faced the prospect of economic reprisal. The worst of the threats came not from lawyers, but from men who felt their authority challenged. Hargreave, in a final act of spite, arranged for 2 of his cronies to pay a threatening call to the cabin where Nell had been biding her time. They came to frighten, to make the point that power could still be exercised outside of the law. They expected a flinch, a woman who would fold and accept the compromise. What they found instead was a circle of women sitting at the table with the ledger between them, resolute. Caleb had been out scouting a movement of the deputy when the men rammed the gate. He returned to find a smashed lantern and the house in disarray. He could have let violence be his rule. Instead, he watched and then embraced the community's immediate response. Liza sent 2 young women to fetch the midwife. Mercy ordered a salve to staunch a cut, and Martha banged pots through the night to summon neighbors. The spirit of female solidarity in the face of force surprised men whose power had been measured in bribes and threats. The attackers, seeing the town roused and aware that they would become the subject of a public story if they did more harm, retreated. But threats do not retreat with a single disgrace. Hargreave used his sway to get the judge to postpone decisions, and he leveraged contracts to get merchants to stop selling to those who testified against him. The town, dependent as it was on trade and favor, felt the pinch. The women Nell had rallied faced choices that were both practical and moral. Do you feed your family or stand with the truth? For some, fear won. For others, the line was clear. They had been wronged and the wrong would not be smoothed over. Caleb's past also complicated things. A reward poster had surfaced in town, and the sheriff used it as justification to arrest him on older charges. The sheriff argued that the law had to run its course. Nell knew that the law and Hargreave's reach were tooling together like a pair of men who have spent too long carving the world for their benefit. When the sheriff attempted to haul Caleb in, Nell did not call him a hero to be free from mistakes. She invoked the law as well. She ensured witnesses were present to say they would vouch for Caleb's presence during critical periods and for his actions on her behalf. The sheriff, seeing the weight of public backing, reluctantly allowed Caleb to remain free on bond. Not every ally stayed. One man, when threatened with business losses, withdrew his testimony. Nell felt the personal sting as betrayal, but she learned to temper it with the knowledge that fear is a powerful animal. The strategy shifted. They needed, now more than ever, not simply testimony, but undeniable proof that would withstand slander and withdrawal. They needed witnesses who could not be bought, and a final disclosure that would leave the conspirators exposed, even if their supporters lied. Nell and Caleb redoubled efforts. Nell focused on documentation, tracing payments, following the money to its real accounts. Caleb used his old contacts to find the papers Hargreave had used to launder funds through other counties. They found a trail into a ledger that belonged to a construction company that had done repairs on the town's bridge, charging more than the work had cost and pocketing the remainder. That ledger showed checks written out in Hargreave's name to men who had been conveniently absent the day of the theft. Once again, they had paper that could not be disputed into silence. The danger these efforts brought was immediate. A man hired to intimidate the witness who had the ledger for a night threatened the woman with worse than threats. He promised harm to those she loved. Nell felt the old fear rekindle. Images of flames, of loneliness, of small comforts snatched away. But she also felt a hot, fresh animal fury. She would not bow to violent men with money. She mobilized the townswomen once more, arranged for the ledger holder to be guarded, and prepared a plan to bring the evidence into the county records in a way that would be difficult to erase. Watching all this, Caleb grew more protective, not through possessiveness, but through respect. He wanted to shield her, to keep her from the knives men used in their more base dealings. Nell rejected full protection. She accepted assistance, strategies, and companionship, but she kept the agency. Her voice continued to lead the meetings. She continued to decide how to use the evidence. She refused to be a quiet object men fought over. She was the loud architect of her own fate. The forces lining up against them had underestimated two things: the stubbornness of a woman who had lost everything, and the cohesion of a group of other women who refused to be bystanders. Hargreave might have wealth and influence, but he did not have the moral courage to withstand the public exposure that Nell had cultivated. The question was not if he would strike, but when, and whether the web Nell and her allies had constructed would be tight enough to hold him when he did. Their worst day came like a storm, sudden, destructive, and nearly final. Hargreave, whose empire had been visibly crumbling under the weight of testimony and evidence, decided to play a last card. He orchestrated a violent ambush on a shipment bound for the town's poorhouse, a delivery of coal and food intended to keep families fed through a harsh spell of winter. The papers Nell had filed showed that the company Hargreave had controlled had been underpaying for supplies and diverting the rest. The delivery, meant to be a symbol of decency restored, became instead the stage for a brazen theft, meant to terrorize and discredit the town's trust in its leaders. Caleb was away when the ambush occurred. He had been tracking a lead out by the ford. He returned to find the townspeople in riot. The deputy, who had always been a double-edged man, used the chaos to seize power, rounding up anyone who had been most vocal against Hargreave and locking them in the holding cell on flimsy charges. Nell, who had been peaceably encouraging people to keep order, found herself being accused of instigating the riot. The twist was as wicked as it was familiar. The men who had been wronged would now be punished for the consequences of their pain. When they brought Nell in, it felt to her like an old world closing. She had been detained not for any evidence of violence, but for being the one who had stirred the town's conscience. The sheriff, eyes hard with the sheen of a man who believed his seat meant he could redefine justice, told her that a woman who doubled as an agent and an agitator could not be tolerated. The deputy locked the cell and slammed the door with the force of men who believed their time had returned. Inside the cell, Nell felt an old familiar, panic, the kind she had felt the night Thomas had died, and she had sat helpless while doctors spoke in menacing verses. But this panic was different. It did not seize her so completely. She closed her eyes and thought of ledger lines, of small digits proofing truth from falsehood. She listened to the clink of other prisoners, to the wind outside. She allowed her chest to fill and empty. Her mind moved through the list of allies. Mercy would not be idle. Martha would not leave town. Liza would know how to bribe a guard if needed. Most importantly, Caleb would be furious. He came with the quiet of a man who had learned that visibility could save a life. He did not break the lock. Rather, he engaged in quiet negotiation with the deputy, leveraging the evidence to show the absurdity of arresting the woman presenting it. He presented a new witness who had seen Hargreave's men orchestrate the ambush. The deputy, who had been depending on fear to carry him, balked when the crowd outside swelled to a chorus of women and men shouting for fair process. Still, the damage was done. The public assault on Nell's character had been staged with a precision that hurt. The deputy used the law to try to neuter her. Hargreave's lawyers pushed forward with suits that would take months to clear. The town's merchants closed their ledgers against her for fear of being sanctioned. The very work that had sustained her, the Wells Fargo office that held the community's money and trust, was threatened with closure because of the political pressure applied to every man in power. The darkest blow came when a man she had called friend, a councilman who had fed her some of the early evidence of corruption, testified for Hargreave under oath that he had been coerced into supporting her claims. Whether he had been coerced or had chosen self-preservation, the effect was the same. Testimony that once supported her now tilted the scales back, and the county judge postponed all hearings indefinitely. Nell was released with a stern warning and a clear message: stay quiet or be made to suffer. This felt like a betrayal on a personal and cosmic scale. The town she had nurtured looked at her with suspicion once again. She found herself at a crossroads where the only options seemed to be retreat or ruin. The press of despair was a physical thing. In those moments, Nell allowed herself to touch the old grief openly, not hide it, but recognize it as part of her armor. "I have lost before," she told Caleb in the thin hour after her release, voice a low thread. "I am not afraid of losing again. I am afraid of losing because I stopped trying." Caleb, for all his resilience, was shaken. He had watched her captured and had felt, for the first time, powerlessness. It humbled him. He could not take the blows away, but he could stand with her in their aftermath. They retreated to the cabin, not to hide as much as to recalibrate, and in the quiet he told her things he had rarely said aloud, of a brother he'd failed, of crimes he'd thought would make him eternal. He did not ask for absolution. He offered his being, flawed, and honest. Nell listened and found in his confessions, not weakness, but the solid remains of a man willing to accept the consequences of his past. The experience hardened Nell, but it did not make her bitter. Instead, it made her more strategic. She used the downtime to organize the women more fiercely, to map financial pressure points, and to find new channels of public accountability outside the judge's control. She reached out to a newspaper editor in a nearby town and supplied him with a copy of the ledger, with cross-references that could not be easily suppressed by Hargreaves' influence. The editor saw the story not as a man's crusade, but as a woman's careful accounting, and he knew the power of such narrative. In the darkest hour, Nell did not fold. She simply altered the mode of fight. She moved from courtrooms and town halls into the broader public sphere. She realized that even if local institutions could be bent, the wider world could serve as an ally. Her plan became less about local retribution and more about systemic exposure. That shift, painful as it had been, introduced a new kind of leverage. People outside Dry Creek could not be bullied by a local magnate. Nell's plan for the final confrontation was precise and relentless. She would not rely solely on local courts to undo Hargreave. She would take the narrative beyond the town's borders and use the very thing men like Hargreave feared most: public exposure that would pierce his social standing across counties. The newspaper editor agreed to run a series of articles. The ledger, cross-referenced and annotated, and testimonies printed alongside them. Nell structured the release like a legal strategy. If Hargreave could use local influence to defer justice, he could not easily erase the printed words spread across state lines. She also understood that the final confrontation would require more than words. There would need to be a show of community power, a demonstration that the town would not bend. She rallied the women and those men who had stood with her. They planned a march to the county seat, not an angry mob, but a dignified procession. Workers with the manifests held high, mothers with their children's shoes, farmers with the receipts of wages withheld. The optics would be clear. This was a town of honest people defending their own. Caleb took the role of logistical muscle. He arranged the transport and ensured that the manifest copies traveled discreetly to the editor. He and a small contingent of allies took position to prevent sabotage. He also used his old connections to contact a man in the state auditor's office who had once owed him a favor in a way that surprised them both. The favor was delivered like a coin. The auditor agreed to look into the accounts if brought the right evidence. Nell's papers were meticulous. Her numbers were clean. Her testimony was prepared. The women polished their statements until they shone. The day they marched, the town of Dry Creek looked like a living ledger. Nell walked at the head, not as a victim, but as a leader. Her posture had changed over the months, less the stooped caution of a widow clinging to memory, and more the straight, steady bearing of a woman who had practiced standing tall. Women and men followed her because they believed the truth mattered more than compromise. They were both fearsome and tender, a force that could not be easily painted as rabble. When they arrived at the county seat, the sight of their numbers and the freshly printed articles in the hands of the editor set Hargreave on edge. He had expected negotiation, not a full civic spectacle. The state auditor received the manifests and made a public statement that he would investigate. The editor's pieces ran across 3 county newspapers within the week, and the narrative shifted from a local squabble to a public scandal. Hargreave's allies found themselves questioned not only by a judge, but by peers and patrons who realized their reputations were at risk. Nell led the hearings with a steady hand, and for the first time, the tide began turning in a way that felt irreversible. Caleb, who had stood at her side through the months of tactics and small cruelties, watched with a kind of awe. She had mobilized not only resources but something deeper, a refusal to allow injury to the quiet of life. Her leadership inspired other women in neighboring towns to bring similar charges of corruption and to support Dry Creek publicly. It was a contagion of courage. The conflict did not end in a single moment, but in a sequence of exposures. Contractors who had cashed checks tied to Hargreave's fake repairs were called to testify under subpoena, and, faced with the written evidence, conceded to the auditor. The deputy was removed from office for dereliction of duty. He was suspended pending further investigation. Hargreave found himself indicted as the paper trail tightened like a net. The mercantile men who had been quietly accepting his patronage began to worry about the long-term harm to their businesses if they did not distance themselves. At the climactic county hearing, Nell did something that startled many. She did not demand vengeance. She recommended restitution and restructuring of contracts. She proposed that the town create a committee of women and men to oversee future contracts and ensure public audits. Her vision was not punitive for its own sake, but reformative. It was a remarkable instance of power used with discretion, and it made the victory lasting. During the months of trials and statements and hearings, other women stepped forward in ways that catalyzed a larger social shift. Mercy Choate, who had begun as a quiet herbalist, testified about the material effects of Hargreaves' schemes on families. Martha Tilley organized fundraisers to support those who had lost wages. Liza Grant coordinated networks of women to carry testimonies to other towns. Their solidarity had been the bedrock of Nell's campaign. She insisted that their names be listed first in all documents, an act that multiplied recognition and ensured that credit for justice would not be held by a single face but by a community. Through the final months, Caleb had a personal arc too. He testified not as a man denying his past, but as a man who had chosen to help rectify the wrongs. He spoke candidly of his own prior crimes and argued for the sort of justice that allowed for reform. It was not an attempt to erase his own wrongdoing. It was an appeal for a society in which men can be held accountable and yet be given paths to betterment. His words resonated with the auditors and the townspeople alike. The day the official verdict was announced, a guilty finding against Hargreave on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, the town felt like it had been exhaled. Nell stood at the courthouse steps in the sun and let the noise of cheering and crying wash over her. The victory was not absolute. Hargreaves' influence had cut deep, and now reparations and restructuring had to be enforced. But the key thing had happened. The rot had been exposed, and the town had found a new backbone. In the aftermath, people approached Nell not as a woman who'd been through misfortune, but as a leader who had helped steer a community back to integrity. Caleb did not step forward to claim her. He stood, as he had for months, at her side, his presence a testament neither of ownership nor of servitude, but of mutual respect. He had found a new path, and Nell saw in his gestures a man who had learned humility and the basics of partnership. The final battle was not a draw of pistols at dawn, but the slow, inevitable unspooling of a man's lies in public records and testimonies. In a packed courtroom where towns from neighboring counties had come to listen, Nell presented the last piece of evidence, a ledger cross-stitched with the names of those who had been paid, the dates and correspondences that could not be explained away. The state's auditor, who had been moved to action by the newspaper articles and by the march Nell led, endorsed the documents and moved to place legal measures to reclaim diverted funds. What made the triumph feel complete was its inclusivity. Women who had been silent in the early months now stood up and told the court how their families had been affected. Children who had gone hungry in a winter that could have been softened by honest payrolls, merchants who had kept accounts open on promises that were never fulfilled. The testimony was detailed, human, and wound with the kind of moral clarity that is hard to argue against in public. It was also, importantly, practical. Restitution plans were put in place, with Hargreave required to pay back funds and to facilitate reforms in how contracts and repairs were negotiated going forward. Caleb's testimony was crucial. He did not attempt to recast himself as a saint, but spelled out clearly the network he'd used as an outlaw, networks Hargreave had exploited. He answered the judge's questions honestly, mitigating the impulse to spin a story that made him look better than he was. In a room where men were inclined to call for blood, his honesty held power. It allowed the court to see nuance in reform, that a person could be accountable and still be given a path to contribute to society. The prosecutor, who had at first been skeptical of a widow's dogged pursuit, proved to be an able advocate for the town. She argued with sharp enunciation that corruption was not a local peccadillo, but a public hazard that required a strong rebuke. This case, she said, is about the right of citizens to have their livelihoods protected. The judge, a man who had grown tired of technicalities that obscured truth, delivered a decision that sought to repair as much as punish. Hargreave was found guilty on multiple counts and ordered to pay restitution and to forfeit certain property to a town fund to rebuild the things his greed had degraded. The courtroom erupted in measured relief. Not all the money could be recovered, and not all wounds would be easily healed, but the system had been nudged back toward fairness. Nell's victory was a model. Neighboring towns began to adopt the oversight committee she had proposed. Women in other counties reached out, asking for copies of the audit templates Nell had drafted. She found herself teaching regional groups how to keep accounts clean, how to present evidence in ways the law could not easily ignore. Her skill, once narrowly defined by a local ledger, became a service to the broader region, and the romance, if one could call the hard-pulled bond between Nell and Caleb that, found its rightful place. It was not the central story. Instead, it was a quiet, measurable partnership. He respected her autonomy, and she accepted his companionship. After the hearing ended, they took a walk outside the courthouse. There was no fanfare, only the soft sound of boots on stone, and the close, steady presence of someone who had been beside you through fever and filing and fear. "You led us," Caleb said, his voice low. "You did the work." He did not attempt to place himself at the center. He offered praise and acceptance, and Nell received it not as a need, but as recognition. She saw him clearly, the good and the rough edges, and felt gratitude for the man he had been and for the man he had become. She chose him, but not because she needed rescuing. She chose him because he had shown himself capable of growth and of holding equality in his hands. They did not marry immediately. They both had things to do. Nell to her new responsibilities as a regional advisor on fair contracts, Caleb to settle debts and to find a legitimate path forward. Theirs was a slow-growing trust, like the rebuilding of a fence that would hold a herd, careful posts, solid ties. In time, they would build that life together, one based on choices, mutual respect, and shared labor. The final scenes of Justice had a quiet domesticity about them that made the victory feel real. The town reopened trade lines with oversight. The poorhouse received the funds it needed to restock for winter. The deputy was replaced with a more conscientious man. The women who had helped Nell were acknowledged publicly and paid small stipends for their role in establishing the oversight committee. It was not a fairy tale where injuries vanished and the world was bright again. The scars remained. Nell still woke sometimes with the memory of Thomas's death and the sound of a smashed lantern, but they were no longer the defining narratives of her life. Instead, she had a ledger of accomplishment, a network of women who would stand together in future storms, and a partner who had learned to listen and to follow when appropriate, and to lead when necessary. Time, which had once seemed a cruel measure of loss, became a means of renewal. Months after the verdict, the Wells Fargo office bore a sign that read, "Not only N. Mercer agent, but beneath it, Regional Representative for Fair Contracts." Nell had been asked to help create a blueprint for transparent dealings across several counties. This new position did not come with power over others. It came with the authority she had earned, the authority to design systems that would make exploitation harder and accountability clearer. She also bought a small parcel of land on the eastern ridge beyond town, a piece that had once belonged to a man who had gambled it away. It was modest, a clapboard house, a lean-to barn, ground that would need work to be profitable. She named it simply the Ledger Farm, half for the literal ledgers it represented, and half for the idea that life could be accounted for honestly. She kept the Wells Fargo office, but the farm became a refuge, her place to practice domestic courage, to teach Caleb how to tend a small plot of beans without expecting instant perfection. The transformation was visible. Where once Nell's clothes had hung like pinned maps of grief, she now wore sturdy dresses and a wide-brimmed hat for the sun, and her hands bore the gardening calluses of a woman who had chosen new labor. She still carried the relic of widowhood, a necklace with Thomas's initials that she wore sometimes when she needed to remember, but it no longer defined her. Her hair, once a coiled shadow of mourning, had softened. Her eyes had the steady clarity of someone who had walked through loss and decided to be more than its echo. Female solidarity continued to be central in her life. The Oversight Committee met monthly at Martha Tilley's bakery, and Liza and Mercy were among its leading members. They had created a small microeconomy that favored small businesses and ensured that contracts were posted publicly, with verifications. The work did not stop injustices overnight, but it stitched up many of the open wounds that Hargreaves' corrupt ways had left. Women across the area wrote to Nell for advice. She answered as an older sister who had been in the ring and left it with the seam intact. Caleb joined her in both practical and symbolic ways. He helped build the fence on the farm and learned the difference between a straight row of beans and a sloppy one. He took on the work of learning legal procedure, sitting with Nell as she wrote new templates for county audits and learning the language of contracts. They shared decision-making, what fence posts to set where, which crops to plant, how to structure payments for workers so women wouldn't be cheated. The sexual chemistry between them was present but secondary. What mattered more was that they built something together that respected both their stories. There were quiet moments that told her story more than any public triumph could. One autumn evening, as the orchard reddened, they sat on the porch and counted coins for the annual school fund. Children ran past with patched knees and bright laughter. Nell looked at Caleb, who had his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, and on impulse she reached for his hand. He did not pull away. Instead, he squeezed, and in that small touch was the mutual understanding that had grown between them. They had chosen each other not to be completed but to be matched. Her new life included teaching too. Nell began a weekly class for women who wanted to learn ledgers and contracts. She taught them how to keep accounts and was fierce about the importance of knowing one's own numbers. "You cannot be cheated if you know your worth," she told them, and the women listened like disciples. They practiced signatures and balanced columns and learned to read the small print that had once been used as a weapon against them. That, she believed, was perhaps the most durable change, equipping women with skills that could not be stolen. As her reputation spread, so did her influence. Officials from 2 counties asked her to speak on panels, and she accepted on the condition they invite women who had wisdom but no microphone. She insisted that the conversation include childcare, accounting for unpaid labor, and the creation of safety protocols that protected female witnesses. Her voice, once small in the back of a ledger room, grew into a reasoned authority. It was not the thunder of the young, but the deep of someone who had weathered winter and learned where to plant seed. Caleb's redemption likewise took shape. He sought an official pardon, willing to accept terms that included public service and restitution. He worked with prisoners on rounded sentences and helped men re-enter society with jobs that did not make them dependent on lawless enterprise. His own change was not claimed as a gift from Nell, but rather as a choice he made after seeing how a community could be steered toward fairness. His past was not erased, but his future was gentler and more honest. When the farm's first harvest came in, Nell organized a community festival. They invited everyone, including those who had opposed her earlier. It was an offering not of triumphalist victory, but of generative peace. Food was shared, dancing occurred, and few things felt better than the sound of children playing untroubled. She stood at the edge of the crowd, looking at the rows of beans, and felt the internal line she had crossed. From a woman shaped by loss to a woman who shaped her own life. She had not given up memory, but she had refused to be defined solely by it. The town of Dry Creek had changed, subtly and profoundly. Men who had been complacent now found themselves in an environment where civic documents were public and where women were not dismissed. The culture had shifted, in small increments, toward accountability. Nell's influence could be felt not as domination, but as a soft, persistent architecture that made the town a safer place for the next generation. And then the quiet ceremony. Not a grand wedding in the church, but a small, deliberate agreement. Nell and Caleb did not stage a marriage for appearances. Instead, they decided together to formalize their partnership with a simple contract, signed in front of friends, stating their shared responsibilities and the sovereignty of each person's property and voice. It was very Nell, practical, principled, and distinctly romantic in its mutuality. They promised to hold each other's faults with the balance of someone who knows the cost of hiding them. Now, sitting on the porch that evening with the orchard hanging like a benediction, Nell thought of the difficult arc of her life. She had been a woman defined by widowhood and suspicion, but she had chosen to be defined instead by competence and courage. Her face had softened, not because she had been rescued, but because she had chosen a life of her own making. The Ledger farm would be a place where others could come and learn, a place where women could see that their hands were capable of more than maintenance. They were the hands that fashioned futures. Her last act in this story was not dramatic. It was a small gesture of connection. She walked to the edge of the orchard and, with steady hands, untied a ribbon from an old ledger and hung it from a low branch. It fluttered like a flag. It was not an answer to grief, but a statement of endurance. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, but she roared. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe that it's never too late to reclaim your power, if you know that the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up, then you found your tribe. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings. Like this story if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own terms. Share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister. Because these stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are.